the intent of the whole process, so we need to figure out what happened. That's likely not going to happen. It's more likely than not that a church that attempts to investigate the allegations is going to come away with a fatally flawed understanding of what those allegations are. They're likely to do more harm than good. And oftentimes they're going to jeopardize subsequent investigations.
Just be mindful of your limits. That's something that's pretty important in responding to abuse. Church leadership is generally not trained on how to investigate. They're not trained on how to do a suspect interview, those kind of things. Be aware that you have those limitations, and that's okay. There are other experts out there who do have that expertise.
Good afternoon. Welcome to our Grace Live conversation today as we discuss the important topic of addressing the role of churches in responding to abuse allegations and fostering safe communities. My name is Zane Hart. I am the interim executive director here at Grace, and I'm so thankful that you all are here joining us today. Our goal today is to equip churches with actionable and helpful steps and give them a clear understanding of some of the best practices where churches can prioritize justice and healing for survivors. We have two incredible experts with us today, Robert and Emily. They're going to guide us through a series of questions and help us think through the do's and the don'ts of responding to abuse allegations. Before they introduce themselves, I just want to remind you to protect, in our work, we're trying to also protect the confidentiality and privacy and safety of survivors. So please refrain from comments with any identifying information about people, places, and so that would help us just to keep people safe. And so we hope that you respect that request. But we'd love for you to interact in our chat and ask questions. We also invited Hannah Fordyce on as well. She's going to be our question person at the end of this time, and we're thankful for her kind of sifting through all the questions and presenting some questions to us at the end from our audience today. All right, so Robert and Emily, take it away.
All right. Well, great to be here. My name is Robert Peters. I'm Director of Institutional Response here at Grace. I've been at Grace in some capacity for quite a while. I first started intersecting more extensively with Grace back during the Bob Jones investigation over 10 years ago. I've been a contractor with Grace for about a decade, then stepped into staff leadership 2 years ago. In that time, I was a child abuse prosecutor, a sex crimes prosecutor, and also worked with several national nonprofits training law enforcement and prosecutors as well. So those are some of the lenses that I bring to this work. Emily?
Hi, everyone. I'm Emily. Thanks for being here today. I'm the Assistant Director for Investigations at Grace and have been with Grace for about 6 years now. I'm also an attorney, and my work history is primarily in civil litigation spaces. But ultimately, I got involved with Grace because I have a very strong heart for survivors of abuse and sharing their experiences. And I also have a heart to help the church be equipped in responding to abuse when it comes up. So that's a little bit about me, but thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Robert and Emily. We're excited to dive into this conversation with y'all. um, so let's dive right in. First question. What is the first thing a church should do when a church learns about an abuse allegation? What are some of the do's and the don'ts there?
Yeah, I'll tackle the first question, and we're starting with sort of the basics. But I think the sad reality, Zane, is that the basics still are often not followed, and we see that unfortunately in our work, in independent investigations or other ways in which we intersect with churches. And the simple answer to your question is report. and report to law enforcement. That doesn't mean report internally, though oftentimes there's certainly wisdom in having those wise structures as well. But external reports to law enforcement immediately when a church learns about an abuse allegation. We know that mandatory reporting law varies, of course, jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And you might, and we've certainly heard faith leaders say, "Oh, well, it's not mandatory in my jurisdiction or whatnot." Irrelevant. It's amazing to me how often, those of us in the church, and I'm a believer as well, will sort of set scripture as, or rather set the law as sort of our baseline, when really it should be scripture and really it should be about how are we prioritizing and protecting the vulnerable. So regardless of whether you're a mandatory reporter, and you probably are in most states, report abuse. Report abuse immediately to law enforcement. It's a basic answer, but it's still a really needed answer. And I would say related to that, you want to be utilizing local resources and know what those are before these abuse allegations come forward. You need to know, do you have a local child advocacy center in your jurisdiction? Do you have a local domestic violence shelter in your jurisdiction? What would be the appropriate law enforcement agency in your jurisdiction? Which one maybe has a specialized unit that deals specifically with vulnerable victims cases, violent crimes cases, child abuse cases? So having all of that knowledge on the front end of what the local infrastructure is, where the best points of contact are, and maybe making some of those relationships can really help with having a robust response that protects survivors. So that's the do, immediately report. And the don't is related to that. One thing that we often say, or see rather, is these investigations, quote unquote investigations by churches before reporting. Church leadership might take it on themselves to assess the credibility of the allegations. The reality is, if abuse is happening within the midst of a church community, the odds are overwhelming that the individuals who would then conduct that investigations have themselves been compromised, have themselves been groomed, and almost certainly don't have the requisite expertise, training, psychological understanding, a host of other issues to accurately assess those allegations. And in any event, there's a huge objectivity gap and objectivity issue. So the intent of the whole process, we need to figure out what happened. That's likely not going to happen. It's more likely than not that a church that attempts to investigate the allegations is going to come away with a fatally flawed understanding of what those allegations are. They're likely to do more harm than good. And oftentimes they're going to jeopardize subsequent investigations. So, for example, that confrontation of the alleged offender, well, that's now going to put that alleged offender on notice that a reporting victim has disclosed. And that's going to greatly impact if there was going to be a subsequent law enforcement investigation. Well, now that individual's on notice, and now law enforcement is really hampered and limited in how they can intersect with that case. It takes some critical strategies off the table for them, which ultimately can have a very negative effect on safety. And of course, there's opportunities then for an alleged offender to destroy evidence, to delete text messages, emails, social media interactions, whatever the case may be. It creates opportunities for the alleged offender to intimidate the victim. And so there's just a host of problematic things. And that for that reason, it's a big don't for our first question.
Yeah, I'll add to that that a lot of churches first hear about abuse from a reporting victim. So it's important to prepare yourself. Abuse allegations can come as a surprise. We commonly hear, people saying, this could never happen here. We never expected this to happen here. But the truth is, it happens quite often. So preparing yourself to have that conversation with a person who has experienced abuse and is coming forward to talk about it with you is important. And it's very important to prioritize the safety of that reporting victim in the space where they're disclosing their abuse to you. And what that means is to actively listen to the survivor. So actively process, seek to understand what they're trying to tell you, respond to them with empathy and with self-awareness, keeping in mind that your response to them is an immensely pivotal moment. I know we often hear from survivors that the response of the church caused more harm to them than the abuse that they experienced. So keeping that in mind, that your response carries a great deal of weight when they're disclosing their abuse to you. Um, Be fully present, pay attention to the nonverbal cues that you're giving off, maintain good eye contact. Ask them open-ended questions, keeping in mind they might not be comfortable answering those questions. It's even good to offer a disclaimer before you start getting into details. It's okay if you're not comfortable sharing some things with me. I may have some questions, but if you prefer not to respond to those, that's okay. Um, Reflect on what you hear they say. Acknowledge that they're in pain, they've experienced a great deal of trauma. Withhold judgment when you're having that discussion with them. Really do your best to create a safe space for the person to share what they would like to share with you, and then be communicative with them about the next steps that you're going to take. So, if that involves contacting law enforcement, tell the reporting victim, I'm going to have to contact law enforcement. If you need to consult with an attorney or insurance company, I know we're going to get into that a little bit more later, but communicate with the survivor that you need to do that. Communicate with the survivor about what you will do with the alleged offender in your congregation. They might have various roles in your church. What are you going to do about that? Communicate that to the survivor. There are other also ways that you can immediately provide support resources to the reporting victim. You could offer potentially compensation for professional counseling with a counselor that specializes in trauma. You could potentially assist them in getting in contact with law enforcement, with a victim advocate, with an attorney. Listen to what their needs are and try to accommodate those. Um, Possibly you could initiate a care team, which would be a source of support for the survivor, keeping in mind that that should be based on the reporting victim's preferences and considering any potential triggers that they might experience by continuing to be involved in a church space. Um, Ways that you can fail to prioritize psychological safety um, would be allowing biases that might exist to influence the response to the reporting victim. So often we see alleged offenders have a very close relationship with church leadership. Maybe they're a member of church leadership. They're well known. They have personal relationships with the alleged offender, and they've seen the alleged offender do good things in the church. And that rapport can influence the way that church leadership responds to a person coming forward alleging that that person abused them. So, avoiding talking about how many good things the alleged offender has done, how much you care about them, how much these allegations are going to harm their reputation or harm their career. Avoiding those things because that can really be silencing to the reporting victim, make them feel that they are not believed and that it's their fault that there's potential harm to this person's reputation or career. Um, Expressing disbelief is also something to avoid. That can come through the form of questions like, "Did you say no?" Or, "Why were you alone with him? Why did you take so long to tell anyone what happened?" These type of questions really reveal the lack of understanding of abuse dynamics. I'll speak a little bit about the why did you take so long to tell anyone what happened question, which comes up quite often. It's really not uncommon for survivors of abuse to delay their disclosure. There's a lot of barriers to disclosure, like something I've already mentioned, which is the fear that it's going to harm the alleged offender. There's the fear that they will not be believed. There's the fear that they will be perceived differently or treated differently. Many other fears as well. That's just to name a few. The average age of disclosure of child abuse in the US is 52 years old. So it's really common for survivors to delay disclosure of abuse for various reasons. And that's not something where blame should be placed on the survivor. It takes time to work through deep trauma and to get to the point where you feel comfortable to share with other people. Um, Another thing I'll mention is just to be aware of any spiritual triggers that might be present in your conversation with a reporting victim. A lot of people who have experienced abuse in a church setting have also experienced spiritual abuse. Very often, the abuser will use grooming tactics that involve faith. They will, maybe lead them to Christ or um, give them advice as it refers to their connection with God, and um, they use spiritual language, scripture, and prayer as a method of grooming. So, given that, it can be triggering for a survivor of abuse who has experienced that to continue encountering spiritual language, prayer, scripture in the future because it's something that their abuser used to groom them. And, some people really panic when they hear those that spiritual language used or have somebody pray for them. So, just something to keep in mind. There are questions that you can ask. You can ask, are you comfortable if I pray with you? Or how has this affected you spiritually? And that can help you gain insight into how comfortable they are with that language being used in that conversation. So, those are just kind of the initial some tips on communicating with reporting victim.
Wow. Robert and Emily, I feel like there's a lot to unpack. There you all shared such incredible do's and don'ts advice, and I'm still processing all the layers of awareness, education, and sensitivity that needs to be fostered and cultivated as a leader in order to do this well. And we're gonna keep going through some questions that we had as an organization that we wanted to really highlight. And so some of the questions, and also we're so thankful for all the questions that everybody has put in the chat so far. We encourage you to use the Q&A button, or the chat. The chat is great for just connecting with the information, but continue to engage with us in whatever way feels best. Um, but just let's pause for a second. And Hannah, are there a couple questions as related to what was just shared that maybe would be good to kind of to get a little bit more context or nuance or understanding that you think some of the questions could help us could bring out?
Absolutely. So I think one of the tensions that exists when we talk about safety, of course, safety is one of the six trauma-informed care principles, is safety can look different. You guys just talked about this. There's physical safety and there's psychological safety and spiritual safety. And sometimes it feels like our duties to these things can be in tension. And so when we're looking at specifically the reporting party or the victim being a minor versus being an adult. How do we balance out the physical safety, which can include things like our need to report to law enforcement, our need to do other physical safety measures, uh, and also respect the agency of the individual, which is another one of the trauma-informed care principles and is part of psychological safety, is how do we provide the opportunities for them to have a voice and to have choices in if something is reported or not, or what steps are taken, especially when we're talking about adults. So can the two of you maybe talk a little bit about both minor versus adults as far as what a church's responsibility is for, should they defer to the victim's preference on reporting or make a report? And then also when we're talking about something like sexual abuse or clergy sexual abuse or physical abuse versus maybe something that's more in the realm of emotional or spiritual abuse.
That is a great and complicated question. And I don't know if the answer will be great, but the answer will certainly be complicated. I think we can meet that. So there's a simple part of that question, which is the when a minor is involved and it's dealing with something that is either relating to physical abuse or sexual abuse. This is a very simple answer. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. Report. Just report to law enforcement. In many states, there's civil immunity for making good faith reports. Even if there weren't, I would argue, as a believer, that our loyalty is ultimately to Christ. What Christ did for the vulnerable, the way he prioritized them is beyond dispute. Report abuse if it's involving a minor because of those safety issues, Hannah, that you just mentioned. When we're dealing with different forms of abuse, obviously spiritual abuse is not going to trigger a mandatory report. At least I'm struggling to think of where it would, absent some other element. um, like potentially clergy sexual abuse, it can be a little more complicated. Um, Emily, let's talk about this dynamic of adults and this tension, which we have had, in investigations, just to peel back the curtain a little bit, when we have adult victims and that tension between empowerment, voice, and choice, one principle, and the principle of safety, that Hannah just mentioned.
Yeah, it's a tricky question. Thanks for
I
putting
saved
me
the
in the
hard
hot.
part for you. Yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. So in general, it is good to prioritize the autonomy of an adult coming forward and reporting abuse in making that decision to take it to law enforcement. But there's some other factors to consider. And if this comes up in your church, I would recommend very highly talking to an expert about this. You could talk to um, an organization like Grace. You could talk to child advocacy centers, various other experts that specialize in abuse. Those are some resources that you could reach out to and have a conversation about this. Some other factors to consider is that even if it is the preference of the adult survivor that the abuse not be reported, there is potential risk of safety to other people. There's also risk of safety to that survivor. So if you're seeing, this alleged offender is commonly with children. He's the youth minister, maybe he volunteers on the weekends with the kids. These are things that would really raise a heightened risk of safety. And so there may be a pressing need for you to report that. Um, if that decision is made, make sure you keep the survivor informed that you still need to report this, and that present your reasons why. He presents a risk of safety because of this, this, and that. Make sure that you keep them informed, and I know that's a really difficult conversation to have. I know a lot of survivors are not comfortable being involved in a police investigation. Um, Ultimately, you could inform them that the police may contact them. um, they can't, Robert, correct me if I'm saying something incorrectly, but they can't typically force them to participate in a law enforcement investigation. They typically won't. So, reporting the abuse of an adult is still important to maximize the safety of the rest of the congregation. Um, but if there is no pressing safety risk, prioritizing the autonomy of the reporting victim is a good thing to do.
Great.
Yeah.
Anything, yeah. Anything you'd add?
Well, no, I think you just illustrated beautifully that the fact that the trauma informed principles are often in tension, and so we sort of have to make choices as we're seeking to be trauma informed in our response to survivors and to abuse. How do we sort of weigh those different principles? Ultimately, our value, and I think safe to say Grace's value is ultimately safety is sort of the penultimate value. These other elements are extremely important: empowerment, voice, and choice, trustworthiness, and transparency. But ultimately, the safety value is our highest value. And so we engage with reporting in a way that maximizes safety. And that looks different in different situations. So I echo what Emily said: seek external advice. There are free consultations and resources available, potentially at CSCs, certainly at organizations like Grace, to walk you through those complex circumstances.
Great. Thank you for diving into that complex question and giving us a complex answer, which I think that's appropriate when there's not an easy solution. There's a lot of factors to weigh. Um, so continuing with safety, safety we know is not just physical. There's psychological, emotional, spiritual. Are there any other do's and don'ts that you can think of around safety that go to how the church should act, both in terms of the survivor, but also the congregation? Um, what other aspects does the church need to be aware of and think through?
Yeah, as we're thinking through the outcome of, or rather the aftermath of an allegation, one of the critical dues that is often difficult, of course, is requiring the alleged offender's absence from church events while the allegations are investigated, be that by a law enforcement entity, be that in an independent investigation context. And that's important for a variety of reasons. Going back to what we just said, that safety principle is extremely important. So while the credibility of the allegations is being assessed by an external party, either law enforcement in a criminal context, independent third party in a non-criminal context, or historic context, potentially, that is a really critical piece for a variety of reasons. One is, the immediate safety risk itself, potentially to the reporting victim or to other reporting victims, depending on the nature of the allegations. There's also a psychological safety element to this. A church's response is not just sending messages to the reporting victim in that immediate case, it's sending a response to every other reporting victim sitting in the church, right? Statistically, that would be about 20% of any church congregation has endured some form of abuse. So that's a critical step to address the psychological safety, if not the physical safety, of all reporting victims while the allegation is being investigated. It also shows that it is a safe place because these are the steps that are being taken while the allegations are being investigated. And we should also know that research tells us that the majority of allegations are valid, and the studies range back and forth between what the particular amount is. Is it 2%? Is it 10%? But the vast majority of abuse allegations are not maliciously false and are valid. So because of that, it's incumbent to take certain safety steps like removing the offender while that process is ongoing, or the alleged offender while that process is ongoing. And I think another point to make here is failing to do that creates an environment where the alleged offender can leverage their power within an organization, within a system, to cause a lot of harm. Again, maybe physical harm, more often psychological harm or spiritual harm, seeking to rally support, doing things that can disrupt the integrity of the investigation, make truth harder to discern, make safety harder to accomplish. So there's a variety of reasons why that's a very important do in terms of prioritizing congregational safety. I think it's related to sort of the don't for this question, which is don't forget to center the vulnerable. Very often we get caught up in sort of all the important pieces that we should think through, right? The legal response and all of those pieces that are critical. But at the end of the day, um, what sort of is critical to our faith as Christians? What is critical to reflect Christ? It's prioritization of the vulnerable. It's centering the vulnerable in our response. And so prioritizing their needs and focusing on those, and not failing to forget that as we're sort of in crisis mode. If anything, it's more important to center the vulnerable when we're in a period of crisis than not.
Awesome. Thank you. That's extremely helpful. So you mentioned care teams earlier on. I'd love for you to expound on care teams. What's a care team? How do they work? And then what are maybe some of the do's and don'ts or the pitfalls of care teams that you've seen or experienced in your work?
Yeah, happy to share about that. Um, so care teams can look differently, but typically you would have at least two care teams, maybe more, which I'll talk about a little bit later. A care team for the reporting victim and a care team for the alleged offender. Each of these teams should involve people who have been trained in trauma and abuse dynamics. Um, Talking about the reporting victims care team first, this should involve multiple people, but should particularly involve at least one dedicated advocate or trauma informed counselor who understands abuse dynamics, the traumatic impact on survivors, who is aware of local support resources, who's familiar with crafting safety plans and boundaries. Now, I say that recognizing that not every church is going to have somebody in their congregation who meets these credentials. It might be necessary for you to seek external support that meets these criteria. But that's very important for your care team to involve at least somebody who's trauma informed and who knows what the effect of trauma is and how to provide support and resources for that person. The care team for the reporting victim should have a direct line of communication with the church leadership. And this is for several reasons. They sometimes reporting victims are just in a stage where they're not comfortable communicating with the church directly. They've experienced a lot of harm, sometimes in the church, um, often related to the church. The alleged abusers usually somebody who's very involved in the church. So they might have challenges communicating with the church directly. It could be re-traumatizing for them to have to do that. It's difficult enough to have to disclose your abuse, and a lot of survivors do that because they want to promote a safe space. They want to make positive change. But it's a difficult thing to go through. So having somebody who can be your point of contact with the leadership of the church is very helpful. Um, the care team should also keep the reporting victim informed of any ongoing response efforts. So, say the church is going to be hiring a third party independent investigator, the care team should make the reporting victim aware of that and who they can get in contact with. Um, the reporting victim's input should be welcomed and prioritized by the care team and then communicated to the church leadership. Um, the alleged offenders care team is a little bit tricky to navigate, right? It should also include someone who has expertise but in abuser dynamics. So, somebody who is aware of cognitive distortions, manipulative tactics, common responses from offenders when they're accused of abuse, somebody who's familiar navigating that. There should be heightened safety requirements for this care team. So, at least two individuals present when offering care to the reported offender. And while it is a space of listening, it's also ministering to the alleged offender by promoting their accountability. So, what that looks like is not agreeing with the wrong acts that the uh, accused offender has been accused of, and encouraging them to be accountable for their actions. Um, the care team should enforce boundaries that have been set in place for the alleged offender and also explain the reasoning behind the boundaries. So, like a boundary Robert mentioned earlier is that we recommend removing the alleged offender from the church campus during an investigation, sometimes afterwards, and explaining to them that that is for the purpose of maintaining the safety of the congregation. Um, Creating a consistent routine where the care team is meeting with the alleged offender and communicating with them about what will happen next. Often, not, I'm not talking about any specific case in any of this, just to add a disclaimer there, but often alleged offenders may struggle with not having control over the situation. So, that communication about what steps are going to happen next can be helpful to de escalate any heightened conversations. Um, The care team should understand that most offenders have also experienced trauma. And while that's not an excuse for their behavior, the care team should be prepared for that to come up in conversation. And that can be a difficult conversation. So, preparing yourself in advance to hear things like that is important. Um, Avoid making promises that the care team can't keep, such as confidentiality. If the alleged offender confesses something in those care team conversations, do not promise them confidentiality. That information is important. You might be asked by law enforcement later or an investigator to disclose information like that, and you don't want to make a promise that you can't keep. So, one thing I'll add is that being part of a care team is pretty difficult. It can be challenging to sit with somebody who's experienced trauma or who's been accused of abuse and continue to support and offer support to them. So, make sure that when you implement care teams, you prioritize the self care of the members of the care team. So, that can look like having multiple members involved. So, you have people maybe stepping in when some need a break, or um, providing access to leadership. So, they have someone to go to for direction, providing some form of debriefing. So, giving them some space where they can debrief what they are experiencing. And you can get creative. Other self care resources are helpful as well. But the goal is to prevent trauma and burnout that they might experience from being in that role. Some common pitfalls when choosing a care team that we've seen. Um, you don't need to wait for certainty about the allegations before providing support. As we mentioned, it's very difficult to disclose abuse. It's difficult to navigate a response to abuse. So you don't need to wait to offer support until you have certainty about what took place. Um, some things to avoid as far as members of the care team specifically. Members of the care team for the reporting victim should not have a close relationship with the alleged offender. That's very important. Members of the care team should not discourage the reporting victim from speaking about their experience with others. So we've seen some care teams where the reporting victim was told, do not share what you experienced outside of this group. That's pretty harmful. It can be silencing. It can make them feel like they're not believed, that what they have to say is not important, that the church is worried about liability that's getting out of control. Um, Peer support is immensely important. It's one of the 6 principles of trauma informed practice, but um, reporting victims need to have people that they trust who they can go to and share what they're experiencing. That should not be limited. Members of the care team shouldn't emphasize that the reporting victim needs to forgive or reconcile with the alleged offender. We see this in most investigations surrounding Matthew 18, application of Matthew 18. I won't get into all the details surrounding Matthew 18. I'll just say that direct confrontation or conversations with an alleged offender of abuse can be extremely re traumatizing. It often doesn't go well. And um, it's not best practice. So I'll just briefly say that. And then don't forget that there are others that need care as well. So, for example, you might have family of the reporting victim in your congregation. They're probably going to be severely affected if their family member comes forward with an allegation of abuse. So, considering ways that they can also be offered care and opportunity to express what they're going through, to debrief it, and to provide feedback to leadership, that's important. Also, for the family and close friends of the alleged offender, I think some of the most difficult conversations that church leadership can have is with the family, the spouse of the alleged offender. And that's not the fault of the reporting victim at all. I want to be clear about that. It's not their fault that the family is experiencing harm because they chose to be transparent about what they experienced. But it is true at the same time that they are experiencing harm and they can feel ostracized from their church community, and that's one of the most difficult things to experience. Sometimes they will be very strongly against the allegations and say that there's no truth to them. Sometimes they will be very angry at the church leadership for taking a strong stance in response to any allegations of abuse against their family member. So those can be really challenging conversations, and I'd encourage the same thing. Multiple team members, make sure you're um, offering them time and support so they can take care of themselves in navigating those conversations. But it's important to maintain care for all of these different groups involved, and also recognize your own limits. Some churches are too small to have 4 different care teams, right? So seeking outside help, there might be a sister church that could offer some folks who could help provide care for these individuals. There might be local victim advocacy agencies that could help in providing care. So just looking into what's available locally can help to navigate the potential burnout that can come up from developing these care teams.
Thank you, Emily. That was really helpful information about care teams. It sounds like you want to have these care teams that have really healthy, experienced individuals on them. Do you think there's any work ahead of time before abuse happens or there are allegations to be done on trying to work on maybe a pool of people that could serve on a care team. Because it sounds like that might be a lot to do that during. I don't know. There's just one question I had, and I think Hannah had a question from our audience as well. Um,
You covered it. Actually, what I
okay.
was going to ask was when we talk about the formation of care teams, is this something that should be done proactively with people in the congregation that have a specific passion point around advocacy or maybe experience, lived experience, or some kind of professional experience? Or is it something that you do more in I don't want to say a reactive sense, but when something comes up, do you pull from the pool of people that are close to that survivor as the support people, or is it some kind of combination of the two?
I think that proactive development of care teams is a great idea. And what we typically recommend is before you even receive any allegations of abuse, you implement a safeguarding team. And so that is usually composed of several members and people who are experienced with abuse, people who are trauma informed, men and women. And that team usually serves to implement policies and practices and receive disclosures of abuse. But they can also be, excuse me, tasked with developing these care teams in advance and really seeking out people in the congregation that want to assist in providing care for those who've experienced harm. So I think that's a great step to take proactively.
Great. So Robert, Emily, we have 4 more questions that we have come up with that we wanted to address. And I'm also looking at the clock. We have 17 minutes till 2, and we also wanted to have time for more participant questions at the end. So Robert, can you just maybe look at the next few questions and think through, okay, what do we really want to share? And then before we open it up for questions um, from everybody else. Or do you want to try to just run through everything and hit some points, and then kind of open it up for question? What are you thinking, Robert?
Well, I think there's a few do's or don'ts rather. Sadly, I'm more negative. I think there's maybe a few don'ts that I would certainly want to hit that I think I can do quickly, and I'd love to hear the remaining questions. Then Emily, if there's a question
Okay.
or two that you'd like to hit, we should do
So
that
you-
also.
do you want to do kind of like some speed rounds?
Do some speed rounds. Yeah,
All
let's put
right,
some
let's
time on the clock. We got
all
this.
right. Next question. How should churches communicate about abuse allegations to their congregations?
Well, so I think so much of this is covered with Emily's really wise thoughts around trauma-informed communications, those pieces of active listening, sort of incorporating the principle of empowerment, voice, and choice, and transparency in communications with victims. I think I love the emphasis that we have on just listen before speaking. Don't listen to respond. Don't listen to be defensive. Don't listen to jump to minimization of liability. Just listen, because there's so much wisdom, to be gained there by hearing what the reporting victim is bringing to you. It's very much a gift, to receive allegations. They're a gift to the community, to the safety of the community, as well as to just the community's broader thriving, when darkness is brought to light. Um, I think certainly acknowledging the seriousness of allegations is important. Protecting the reporting victim's identity and confidentiality is, of course, extremely critical. I think one of the trickiest things about for churches in communicating about allegations is the reality that if you're a church leader, your audience is extremely complex. You have individuals who are, of course, the direct parties themselves, the reporting victims and alleged offenders, and their families, right? And there's a ton of complexities in how you want to communicate just given that. There's the broader community, some who have no connection with these individuals, some who have very close connection with these individuals. And so, how do you communicate in a way that doesn't create sort of camps or factions, but stays focused on a trauma-informed response to abuse allegations. Um, and then, the reality that I mentioned earlier of so many reporting victims being within the broader congregation, and so the complexity of that as well. The reality also is in a decent sized congregation, there's likely also other offenders who are watching your response, and it's saying, what type of community is this? Is this an environment where they can operate well and with impunity, or is this an environment that's very unsafe for offenses against either adults or children? So keeping that in mind, I think it's critical certainly to not minimize the allegations. Um, the So that's a clear don't minimize the allegations in communications. We often see this happen in the context of like PR firms or law firms where it's referring to things like an affair. So adult clergy sexual abuse, which I see a lot in the chat, referring to that as simply as an affair. Instead of an egregious abuse of authority, right? And the spiritual abuse that accompanies that, the exploitation that adult clergy sexual abuse is. So avoiding those sort of minimizing descriptions. It was inappropriate. It was a mistake. It was a sin. A lot of things are inappropriate. A lot of things are mistakes. A lot of things are sin. And adult clergy sexual abuse it may be all those things. It's also a lot more than those things. It's minimizing and problematic to refer to them as that. I think the other pieces, Emily, you really talked about well in terms of, what does trauma-informed communications look like? Zane, I definitely want to jump to a question that we had discussed around a risk management approach when dealing with abuse.
Go for it.
So, this is something we see a lot, unfortunately, both in our investigations and our consultations. And it's this framework that many churches are following. And to not get too far into the weeds on this, but shameless plug for the podcast. I saw there was a graphic at the beginning of this Grace Live. We're going to be talking a little bit about these types of dynamics as podcast episodes roll out in the next month. But I think this is one of many ways that broader corporate uh, context has infected the church, right? This broader corporate context of guarding profit, maximizing profit, protecting profit instead of protecting the vulnerable. And so we have this risk management approach exported from sort of the corporate world, which is not particularly based in the life and teachings of Jesus Christ, and then we're applying it in the context of the church to say, let's maximize our fiduciary responsibilities. Now, fiduciary responsibilities are important. We should exercise stewardship over what God has given to us within faith communities, certainly. But to maximize and protect the institution over the individual is obviously extremely problematic. So, in terms of a don't here, don't respond to abuse allegations with that being your primary priority. Respond to abuse allegations with your primary priority being faithful to the life and teachings of Jesus Christ, which means protect the vulnerable, full stop. It doesn't mean centering the bottom line. It means centering the vulnerable. And so that doesn't mean don't talk to attorneys, don't talk to insurance companies. Of course, it would be irresponsible to not engage with attorneys or insurance companies. But at the end of the day, don't follow the attorneys or the insurance companies when they conflict with the life and work of Jesus Christ.
So important to hear that. I was recently at a conference where a speaker was training people on handling allegations of abuse, and I heard them mention the elders and the board's response. The fiduciary responsibility was really important, and they said it over and over again. And they maybe mentioned caring for people was also important. So yes, of course, like fiduciary responsibility is a part of a church leaders, elders or boards responsibility. But why is that? Why can that be misleading sometimes?
I think for a variety of reasons, but I think it can create sort of an ethical cover to do the wrong thing. It can create an excuse to do the wrong thing. And you can talk yourself into this dilemma of, oh, I have to protect the ministry or I have to protect the resources so it can go and do these other things. And that's the same reasoning we see in abuse crisis after abuse crisis, right? If we go back decades now to the investigation in the Boston diocese, right, is featured in the film Spotlight, right? The focus, there are elements in that movie that talk about, oh, we can't bring this up, the fact that we're, spreading priests here and there, even though they're accused of abuse, and we can't hold them accountable because look at all the good we're doing in the community. It's the exact same rationale, right? It's putting resources and quote unquote ministry and quote unquote reputation, over the lives and prosperity of individuals. And so deeply problematic for a variety of reasons. Emily, I got to some of the key questions I wanted to get to. Were there any that you didn't get to that we could discuss while still leaving some time for additional questions?
Maybe we go to the questions in the chat. I think we well, I guess one sorry. One thing I'll mention, I'm looking over my notes. Um, just be mindful of your limits. That's something that's pretty important in responding to abuse. Um, Church leadership is generally not trained on how to investigate. They're not trained on how to do a suspect interview, those kind of things. Be aware that you have those limitations, and that's okay. There are other experts out there who do have that expertise. Um, o Other limits to be aware of is, financial limits. You might not be able to do everything that we recommended here on this call today, but are always alternatives. So if you ever have any questions about that, feel free to reach out to us. Feel free to reach out to other experts on how you can provide support in a way that is feasible for your financial status. Um, be mindful that the alleged offender may have also groomed you, and that's a common thing we see, but we call it grooming the community, and it's that they present to the world like they're this wonderful person and that they would never do anything to harm anyone. And they truly have done a lot of good things. They've volunteered in a lot of capacities. They've brought a lot of benefit to people in the church. So it can be difficult to see all of that and then hear this abuse allegation, which is so horrible. You would never think this person would do that. But be mindful that this happens all the time, and that's a common character trait of abusers. Not everyone who's helpful is an abuser. I want to be clear, but that's pretty common for them to have a good reputation, for them to make it so that the rest of the community would never suspect them of doing anything such as that. Um, Keep in mind that sexual abusers, they have very complex psychological issues that need specialized, trained individuals to help navigate. Um, so, try and seek out those resources for them if you can. But don't take it on yourself to think you're going to heal this person or change them from their ways or make it so that they never abuse anybody again, because it's a very complex psychological issue. So it requires the same level of expertise. But that's just a few things. We can go to questions now.
Well, thank you so much. Hannah, I've given you the fun task of wading through so many amazing questions to maybe give us one or two that we could possibly get to at the end here with about 6 minutes left. So, Hannah, what do you got for us?
Ooh, there's so many good questions on this topic. We could have this webinar go on all day. And maybe we will do a follow-up at some point. And if you do have any pressing questions we don't get to, please feel free to reach out to us. And we would be more than happy to email you back. But one of the questions we have is if law enforcement declines an investigation or declines charges when there is an investigation, is there still grounds for an additional third-party investigation? And if so, what factors should be considered in making that decision, especially if it comes to the agency of the survivor or the victim, if they're maybe not interested in pursuing an investigation?
Such a good question. One of the factors certainly is what you just mentioned. What are the interests of the survivor? That in that principle of empowerment, voice, and choice, is this something that they're supportive of, something that they're asking for, or something that they don't want? That's a critical consideration. It's not the only consideration, but it's an extremely important one. And so I don't want to gloss over that. I think some other considerations are certainly, just taking that trauma-informed lens, right? Thinking through those other five principles of trauma-informed practice. Safety. If law enforcement declines to press this and we need some sort of additional clarity, so we take maybe employment action, or maybe even if they're not an employee, there's some other sort of safety dimension. Thinking of that safety principle, does an independent third-party investigation help answer questions or give recommendations that enhance the safety of our community, both now in the context of this investigation, or this allegation, as well as prospectively? So I think that would be another piece. Another principle to consider here, the principle of trustworthiness and transparency, right? What do we need to do to show the congregation that we're being transparent about this, that we are trustworthy in our response to this, that we're not hiding this, we're not seeking to cover this up? So this, like we discussed earlier, a lot of times these principles are held in tension, and we really have to carefully weigh them because they could pull in different directions. Ultimately, to reiterate what was said earlier, to me, I think the guiding principle, the first among others, is the safety piece. And so then you just operate with integrity and transparency as you're communicating with others who maybe don't like the decisions you make. That is the role of leadership, folks. No one likes what we do. It's absolutely thankless work, but we do it anyway because it matters, because there are vulnerable individuals that depend on those in leadership to prioritize safety and to center the vulnerable. That means making unpopular decisions, and standing by those and still communicating those, even with those who may disagree with them. Anything you would add there, Emily?
I think that was well said. I think um, if there's a situation where law enforcement chooses not to investigate, it might be because the statute of limitations has run up. So it doesn't necessarily mean that this did not happen. So there's no point in looking into it. There certainly could still be a lack of factual clarity that requires further investigation, especially if you're going to make concrete decisions like removing this person from your congregation or paying for counseling for somebody for a long period of time. Those kind of things can be helped by a third party independent investigator looking into it. And it's also helpful to just look into your policies regularly anyway. So that's part of our independent investigations. I know other organizations also do policy assessments, but that's something that can really be benefited by an expert looking at your policies, offering you recommendations to really key in on those prevention and detection methods. So that's all I'd add.
I would say that that sparked two more very brief things. I would say also, depending, another factor to weigh here is who is the accused, right? Because if this is an individual in a leadership position, I think that becomes more important, because it enhances the safety principle, it enhances the trustworthiness and transparency principle to sort of take that additional step of a third party investigation, versus if this is sort of a lower level position, maybe there's less of a necessity there. I think another thing I would say is, to what extent is that factual clarity needed? Because sometimes folks come to us wanting an independent investigation to validate what they already know is a legitimate allegation. If you already know that it's a credible investigation, certainly you may learn more from an independent investigation, so there may still be reasons to do it, but you might not need that independent investigation. You might just need to do the right thing, and not wait for someone else to tell you to do the right thing that you already know to do.
Well, with that, Robert, Emily, we have come to the end of our time. And I just want to thank you both for sharing the incredible insight to this vital conversation. And clearly from the questions, the amount of questions and the comments, this is something that we need to have a follow-up discussion. Would you be open to that at some point? Um, to
Absolutely. Yeah. You know where to find us.
All right. So we have a lot of great questions that we can base our next conversation on. Um, and it's clear that addressing abuse in churches is, it's important that we respond well to abuse, that we have the readiness to do that. But I think also, just a reminder, there's so much we can do on the prevention side. to prevent abuse, to work to recognize grooming behaviors, different things, and to set up safeguards, codes of conduct, policies, training. And so we just encourage you as a church leader or as an individual in your church, continue to work for that, advocate for those things, speak up in your church. Grace provides services both on the response side, but also on the prevention side. And so please reach out to us. We're netgrace.org is the organization, is our website, and you can learn more about our services there. But we hope that this discussion has helped provide just some actionable steps for you today to help you get a deeper understanding of the complexity and dynamics involved when trying to respond well to abuse and to protect the vulnerable within our communities. Thank you so much for joining us today. And just lastly, we're a nonprofit, we're 501c3. This is the type of thing where we don't generate revenue. We have other services that generate revenue, but we also trying to create resources for the church and for individuals. And that requires that we also raise money. So if there's, on our website, we have a donate page. If you're led to give a donation, we'd be encouraged by the support. And sorry, I just said lastly, but the last thing I wanted to say is thank you so much for everybody who has shared their encouragement to us in the midst of our former executive director's passing. The past few weeks have been extremely hard for a lot of us here at Grace, but we've also felt just this immense amount of love and support from so many people. And we just want to say thank you from the deepest parts of our heart for that support, the encouragement, and the love that you've all shared. But with that, just want to say have a great day, and thank you for tuning in today.
In the calm and in the storm, when it feels I'm all alone, it's your hand if I hold. In each hour of unrest, when it seems I've nothing left, you speak peace in every